York Post writer has decided to quit the Rupert Murdoch-owned tabloid, the New York Post, after somehow realizing for the first time that she's gonna be pressured to write negative news articles about people like Kamala Harris. And according to her open resignation, that's exactly what happened. Under the tabloid-ready headline, "Cam on In," the Post claimed that copies of a children's book written by Vice President Kamala Harris were provided at taxpayer expense in a welcome kit for unaccompanied migrant children at a shelter in Long Beach, California. And of course, just as you would expect with any tabloid, you get cheesy covers that look like this. And of course, they show an image of just one children's book, and they put out an entire fake story about it. And to be clear, the story is fake. The narrative here is unfounded. There was absolutely no evidence that this was actually happening, that taxpayers were footing the bill for Kamala Harris's children's books. But it was written, it was published, and you also got that incredibly goofy cover. Well, the aftermath is pretty fascinating because it turns out that the writer has stepped down because she claims she was forced to write this piece and that it was completely inaccurate. No books by Harris were provided by government officials at the shelter, and the sole copy seen in the photograph that the Post published on its front page had been donated through a neighborhood toy and book drive for the migrant children. So Laura Italiano is the person who wrote the article. And so just last night on Twitter, she shared with the world an announcement. Today I handed my resignation to my editors at the New York Post. The Kamala Harris story, an incorrect story I was ordered to write and which I failed to push back hard enough against, was my breaking point. And then she says, it's been a privilege to cover the city of New York for its liveliest, wittiest tabloid, a paper filled with reporters and editors I admire deeply and hold as friends. I am sad to leave. But guess what? The damage is already done because this is how the right-wing media ecosystem works. You put out some false narrative, some false news story. I mean, it just happened with these accusations regarding Biden rationing red meat in order to save the environment. That was a completely made up story. And the media just ate it up. They went with it, conservative media, of course. And Fox News covered it as if there's gonna be a rationing of red meat. You had all sorts of right-wing politicians repeating it on Twitter. And that's exactly what happened in this case with the Kamala Harris story. So the headline, for instance, on Fox News, by the way, which still stands today. I saw this headline this morning after it was already abundantly clear that the story was fake, that the writer had stepped down. It said Kamala Harris's office stated ignorance of how her book was available for migrant kids at California shelter. It's currently the headline. I would argue you should probably change the headline. They updated the story, but most people see headlines and that's it, it's over. And they get ideas in their heads and they're already misinformed about what the situation really is. So why didn't Fox News change their headline? I'd love to know the answer to that question. Updating it at the bottom of the article isn't enough. Also, Laura Italiano gets no cookies. You get no cookies, you don't get any respect, you don't get any props because you decided to write the article and then you quit. I would argue that a smart person who finds it reprehensible, who finds it problematic, unethical to write fake news stories would step down before writing the fake news story. But she decided to write the fake news story first and then she quit. No cookies for you, I'm sorry. But I think the biggest takeaway from this story is the fact that this is not rare. This just isn't rare. This happens all the time to different extent. Right, to a different extent. So in this case, it was clear that they had a fake news story and they decided to run with it, even though it was just wholly inaccurate. In other cases, there's pressure to avoid doing negative news coverage on your sponsors. In other cases, you might not want to cover a negative news story regarding your political, people you agree with politically. I mean, this kind of stuff happens all the time. And sometimes it's explicit. Sometimes it's a little implied, but when you have 6 major corporations own 90% of the media, you're gonna have a problem. You're gonna have biased media. You're not going to have a diversity of opinions or a diversity of perspective for a publication that's owned by the Murdochs. You're just not. You're gonna get a very simplistic worldview based on so-called conservative values. And conservative values are not anything that they would describe. It has nothing to do with family values. It has nothing to do with American patriotism. We know what conservative values are. Conservative values are corporate values. And guess what? You see the same thing in corporate mainstream media as well. This effort to immediately question how to pay for robust policies that would dramatically improve Americans' lives. But you don't get that same type of commentary or that same type of criticism when it comes to defense contractors, when it comes to engaging militarily in Asia, for instance, which we've certainly been doing since the end of the Obama administration, when he had his so-called pivot to Asia. We started arming India, we started arming Japan, we started selling record numbers of weapons to countries in that area, in an effort to try to intimidate China. You never hear any critical coverage about stuff like that, because a lot of these defense contractors are sponsors for the corporate media. A lot of them are actually tied to the major corporate conglomerates that own 90% of the media. So look, this is my way of saying that corporate influence in media, political agendas in media is as common. I mean, it's as common as Cenk, doing a cheesy dad joke on the show. It's just every day. Every day, the coverage you get is thought through carefully. And sometimes, you just have that thought in the back of your mind, I don't want to upset my sponsors. Other times, they don't want to be talking about corporate influence. They don't want to talk about money in politics, because it's really hard to pass judgment when your media organization is funded by fossil fuel companies. So this is a more extreme example because it's just such a false story and they reported it as if it was true. And what I also find interesting is that all these journalists running around, or all of these editors who clearly have a political agenda, have to immediately stoop to the lowest common denominator in order to smear their political opponents. I'm not saying that Kamala Harris is perfect. I'm actually saying Kamala Harris has quite a few things that you could legitimately criticize her on. But they don't want to do that work. They would rather go to these made up narratives, manufactured controversies in order to attack her. Why not do your jobs? If you actually do some reporting, if you're a true journalist, I'm sure that you can find things in regard to Kamala Harris's performance as a prosecutor in California, for instance. Her votes in the Senate. I mean, there's actual substantive things they could focus on, but they decided not to do that. Because A, they think their readers are stupid, and so they try to find ridiculous scandals to scare them. And B, they're lazy, they don't want to do anything tough. Real reporting takes resources, money, and courage, and they don't really like to hire people like that. So Laura Italiano, I apologize for your joblessness right now, but maybe you should have thought of that before working for a right-wing tabloid, as, by the way, she referred to it as a tabloid herself.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR, so those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.